Hey guys, it's Coach Barrowline. We're going to talk a little bit about the American West today. We're going to talk about the settling of the West. And, even during the Civil War, there was conflict and settlement of the West. But really, after the war, it really picks up as people leave the reconstructed South and the cities of the East in search for land and new opportunities. Of course, that leads to conflict with the people that are already there, Native Americans. So we're going to talk a little bit about that more in detail. So we're going to kind of be moving back and forth here as we talk about this. But by the 1890s, Native American culture was really dying out, and many had turned to a prophet named Wovoka, who said that a ghost dance, actually he called it a circle dance, one of the one of the translations in English, a spirit or ghost dance. But he believed that if they performed this dance, that basically the the world would be swept away, and a new world a new world would be in its place. And he believed that the ghost dance would bring this about, and really thousands of people follow him. And this makes American officials very skittish. And we'll talk about the impacts of that later on. So from the mid 1800s on, you have a steady stream of white settlers into the land of the Plains Indians, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Blackfoot, the Kiowa, the Comanche, and most of them, these Indians, did not settle in towns. They were hunters, and they didn't understand the idea. They understood it on an intellectual level, but they didn't really believe in the idea of land ownership. Of course, white settlers believed that land could be owned and bought and sold like any other commodity. Also, you see the Indian government's policy is going to change from pushing Indians further west to creating reservations for them to live on, and we'll talk about that also. Of course, being confined to reservations is really going to destroy the buffalo-centered way of Plains Indians' lives. And as the buffalo are driven to extinction and they're being forced on a reservation, basically their way of life is going to be dramatically changed. And finally, you obviously have this tension from the mid 18 to the late 1800s. There's going to be many battles, many conflicts, and this is going to be known as the Indian Wars. So there are literally hundreds of skirmishes and battles and fights in the Indian Wars. But probably the three most famous are first the Sand Creek Massacre, which actually happens during the Civil War in 1864. There was a group of Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians who had agreed, who had come to seek peaceful negotiations, and they were encamped along the Sand Creek, and an army unit led by a Colonel Shivington, I believe, or Chivington, I can't remember exactly, leads an attack on the encampment, which killing about 150 people, very few of whom were actually fighting age men. Most were older men and women and children. It also killed some of, I think, like 8 of the leaders of that contingent, which were the most moderate leaders that wanted to seek peace with the white man. And it actually leads to more conflict because the people that take the Indian leaders that take power, the more radical, more willing to fight against natives, and it winds up leading to more tensions. Even though Congress condemns the action and actually decides to give some land as reparations, which of course the U.S. government takes back 2 years later, really very little is done to punish the actual commander. Of course, the most famous battle is the Battle of Little Bighorn and Custer's Last Stand and all that. And basically, the Sioux, under leadership of Sitting Bull, had settled near the Little Bighorn, and many other groups kind of joined them at that time, groups that had refused to join the reservation. Plus, they had a lot of Indians that had unofficially left the reservation for hunting season. So you had a very large encampment, and Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, he's called General on your notes because he was given a battleship commission as a general in the Civil War, but he was actually technically a lieutenant colonel at the time. But anyway, he comes upon the encampment leading, 700 or so troops, and decides to attack. and of course is slaughtered in less than an hour of battle. He's lost all the men in his battalion, plus many of the men in his other battalions that he had split up. So it's a, a, a huge defeat for the U.S. cavalry, and it really kind of makes Custer a hero initially, and kind of galvanizes public opinion in support of the Indian Wars. And the last battle, really in the Indian Wars, is the Battle of Wounded Knee, which really is not much of a battle. Basically, uh, many Sioux who had surrendered, many natives who had surrendered were encamped at Wounded Knee, and the U.S. Army went to disarm them. There was a disagreement or a scuffle. Some sources indicate that there was a warrior who was deaf and couldn't hear, and he refused to give up his weapon. So there was a scuffle, a weapon went off, and basically the soldiers who were already skittish because of the ghost dance that I talked about earlier. The ghost dance had been going on, and American officials were worried that this was a sign of a larger issue. Even though Wovoka he preached nonviolence, this made leaders skittish. So the Army officers were already worried that there was something brewing. So they basically ordered soldiers to fire on the camp, and over 300 Native Americans are killed, many of them women, children, and the elderly. And the massacre was even shocking to Americans back east, and there was a big congressional investigation and all that kind of thing. But really, the upshot is it ends Native American resistance on the plains. Now, further west, there had been uh, resistance against white settlement as well. And the Nez Perce, who were led by the famous Chief Joseph, had been um, raiding in the Idaho area for years, and they're hounded by the U.S. cavalry. And finally, they flee to Canada, but are finally captured in 1877. And of course, Chief Joseph gives his famous "I will fight no more forever" speech that some of you guys may have read in school. In the Southwest, and Southwest and along the Arizona-Mexico border, you had Geronimo, who led a small band of Apache warriors for years. They actually eluded capture for years. I mean, a huge contingent of American cavalry, U.S. cavalry, was after them, but they were finally captured in 1886. So as we said, by 1890, most of the Native American resistance to white settlement is over, and the United States begins to create reservations. Whereas before, the U.S. government had a policy of just continually pushing the natives further west. I think the government finally realized that we wanted as much land as possible, and eventually we were going to run out of places to push them, so to speak. So the Native Americans were then forced to stay on reservations, and many times they were forced to farm and otherwise give up their traditional culture in favor of white American culture. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which managed the reservations, set up public schools, oftentimes forcing children to leave their homes and forcing them to practice Christianity and speak English, and basically turn away from their traditional way of life. In 1887, the passage of the Dawes Act did break up some reservations and divide the land amongst the natives. However, much of the best land was sold to white land speculators and white settlers. And of course, many settlers come from the east and even other countries to find riches after the gold rush, California and other places. And you have mining communities that sprout up, some that grow into major cities like Denver. What happens eventually, though, those individual miners can't get to the stuff deep in the ground, so the big companies come in, and people who used to work for themselves as miners now are working for the major companies, and very dangerous work for very low wages oftentimes. Another big business is ranching. In the 1500s, the Spanish had introduced cattle, and they had been running wild basically on the plains for hundreds of years. And once they're bred with the English cattle, the new type of cattle is called, what we would know as Texas Longhorn today. So cattle and sheep farming, but sheep herding, but especially cattle herding becomes the major business. And you see the advent of the cattle drive. These ranchers will drive their herds up to on the Chisholm Trail from San Antonio up to Dodge City, Kansas, to load their cattle onto trains to go to Chicago and be slaughtered for beef. Eventually, barbed wire is really going to end the cattle drive as big ranchers consolidate their properties and can really manage larger herds. And this leads to conflict between free grazers and the big ranchers, but eventually the large ranchers, of course, are going to win out. And of course, farming is going to wind up being the big business of the plains, and it gets a boost during the Civil War when Congress passes three acts. The Homestead Act basically gives 160 acres of land to anybody that's willing to farm it for 5 years and build a home there. Pacific Railway Act gives railroad companies millions of acres to basically build the Transcontinental Railroad. And then, of course, the Morrill Act is the first time the federal government really funds higher education, and you have the establishment of agricultural and mechanical colleges. So Texas A&M, for instance, is formed with those funds. Also in 1880s, a land speculator finds 2 million acres of land in the Indian Territory that hadn't been claimed by a tribe. So he opens it really illegally to settlement. He gets the government to open it to settlement to white settlers who come in the thousands, and of course come to stake their claim to land that's essentially free at the time. The new settlers come from all different walks of life. Most whites, a lot come from the South, fleeing, getting away from Reconstruction and those types of things. Many blacks come because they're trying to get away from the racial discrimination and violence they've experienced. Um, Also, European settlers come mostly because Europeans were land poor. Most people in Europe didn't have the possibility of ever owning land. So you have Irish, Germans, even Russian Mennonites coming to settle land. And of course, the Chinese came initially to California for the gold rush, but their labor is instrumental in building the railroads, and they're also very involved in establishing agricultural base in places like California, Oregon. And they face discrimination much like African Americans and Hispanics do as well. Of course, families face all kinds of challenges. The winters are cold, the summers are hot, there's a lack of water. They have to learn irrigation a lot of times from Hispanic and Native American farmers. There's a lack of wood, so they build their houses out of sod. The soil is very hard to plow, so the invention of steel plow and combines and harvesters really going to turn uh, farming into a big business. And much like what we see with mining and ranching, eventually the large farms and corporations are really going to take over plains farming in the 1900s. So in 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau issues a report that basically says the frontier is closed, that there's no new land left to settle, that everything's been pretty much settled. And this kind of marks the historical end of westward expansion. Although people still move west and things of that nature, it's kind of the end of an era. In 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner writes this essay saying that the frontier gives the U.S. a unique quality, and it's a big part of American culture. And there are certainly some major impacts of Western migration on the United States. Of course, that migration is caused primarily by economic potential. People want to make money, they want land, and there are jobs available out there. And once Native Americans end their resistance, it really kind of uh, it allows the government to pour settlers into territories formerly controlled by Indians. Of course, the impacts are wide-ranging. Native American ways of life are destroyed, but mining communities are established, ranches are established, cattle industry, beef industry booms, and farmers settle on the plains in large numbers. So the resources and the farming agricultural products that come out are huge for America in the future.